What if I told you that the United States could lose its global hegemony not in 50 years, not in 30, but in just 10? We're not talking about nuclear war nor an alien invasion. We're talking about a sequence of strategic decisions, some already underway, that if combined with surgical precision, could destabilize the American empire from within, without firing a single missile. Imagine a plan that begins with the manipulation of global supply chains, then the collapse of the dollar as a reserve currency, next the fragmentation of military alliances, and finally the final blow, the war of narratives won by those who don't even need tanks. Sounds like fiction? Perhaps, but each step of this plan already has historical precedents, real actors, and vulnerabilities that Washington prefers to ignore. In this video, I'll show you how I would dismantle U.S. hegemony in just 1 decade, using only strategy, influence, and perfect timing. If you wanted to bring down the United States without firing a shot, where would you start? The answer: at the invisible foundation of American power, the dollar. Since 1944, with the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar became the global reserve currency. This means that countries around the world need dollars to buy oil, conduct international trade, and protect their economies. It gives the U.S. a superpower. They can print money that the entire world accepts. But what if that superpower were deactivated? The first step of the plan would be to accelerate de-dollarization, something already underway. China, Russia, Iran, and even strategic allies like Saudi Arabia have already begun making bilateral deals in other currencies. In 2023, for example, trade between China and Russia in yuan exceeded 90%. Beijing also launched the e-yuan, a state digital currency with the potential to replace the dollar in international transactions, especially in countries sanctioned by the U.S. The second step would be to undermine confidence in the American financial system. How? By exposing its internal fragility, unpayable debts, persistent inflation, and an increasingly dysfunctional political system. Imagine a coordinated disinformation attack that fuels fear of fiscal collapse. Global investors would begin seeking alternatives: gold, cryptocurrencies, or state digital currencies. The third step would be to create a new parallel financial system led by an alternative bloc. Think of the BRICS, but with real infrastructure, development banks, payment systems independent of SWIFT, and trade agreements that exclude the U.S. This is already being tested on a small scale. The plan would be to scale it up. If the dollar loses its status as reserve currency, the U.S. loses the ability to finance its deficits easily. That means less money to maintain military bases, less influence over allies, and more internal instability. And all of this can happen without a single shot fired. If the dollar is the body of American hegemony, narrative is the soul. The second axis of the plan is simple but devastating. Win the information war before the U.S. realizes it's even fighting. Today, America's global influence doesn't depend solely on tanks or treaties. It depends on the idea that the U.S. is the leader of the free world. This idea is fueled by Hollywood, universities, NGOs, international media, and social networks. But what happens when that image begins to crack? The strategy here is to use America's own tools against it. Platforms like TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and Telegram become weapons of delegitimization. The goal isn't to convince the world that another country is better. It's simply to sow doubt, distrust, and fatigue with the American model. Imagine coordinated campaigns that expose historical hypocrisies of the U.S. CIA-backed coups, wars based on lies, racial inequality, police violence, and corporate influence in Congress. All of this is already public.
The plan would be to amplify, dramatize, and go viral. Now add deepfakes, bots, and generative AI. By 2025, it's already possible to create fake speeches from presidents, videos of protests that never happened, and manipulate images in real time. Truth becomes a matter of opinion, and in that chaos, America's moral authority evaporates. But the most subtle blow comes from within, fueling internal divisions. Political polarization, conspiracy theories, distrust in institutions. The more Americans fight each other, the less they can project power outward. Meanwhile, other powers offer an alternative narrative: order, stability, growth. It doesn't need to be true, it just needs to seem more attractive than American chaos. Result? Countries in the global South begin to distance themselves from the U.S., not out of fear, but by choice. America's cultural and moral hegemony dissolves, and with it, its ability to lead.
U.S. hegemony doesn't sustain itself alone. It depends on a web of military, economic, and diplomatic alliances that guarantee access to markets, military bases, and international legitimacy. But what if that web began to unravel? The third axis of the plan is precisely that: imploding the alliances that sustain the American empire. We start with NATO. The world's most powerful military alliance is already showing signs of fatigue. France and Germany have interests increasingly divergent from the U.S. The war in Ukraine exposed these fractures. While Washington pushes for more weapons, many Europeans want to negotiate. The plan would be to intensify these tensions with disinformation campaigns, strategic leaks, and influence operations that fuel European resentment against American dominance. Then comes the Indo-Pacific. Here, the target is Japan, South Korea, and Australia, pillars of containment against China. The objective would be to create internal dilemmas: protests against American bases, scandals involving espionage, or diplomatic crises that force these countries to reassess their dependence on Washington. Beijing already does this with mastery. The plan would simply be to accelerate it. And the most symbolic blow? Breaking the link with Saudi Arabia. If Riyadh decides to sell oil in yuan or rubles, the petrodollar collapses. This not only weakens the dollar, but also isolates the U.S. in the Middle East. The key here is to offer Saudi Arabia something the U.S. cannot: stability without political interference. With alliances in collapse, the U.S. faces a dilemma: either spend trillions to maintain its global presence by force, or retreat and lose influence. Both options are bad, and that's exactly what the plan wants. The American empire wouldn't fall with a bang, but with the subtle sound of doors closing, one by one. No empire falls from external pressure alone. The final blow almost always comes from within. The fourth and final axis of the plan is to transform the United States itself into its greatest enemy, not with tanks or missiles, but with internal chaos, political paralysis, and institutional collapse. It all begins with polarization. Today, Republicans and Democrats live in parallel realities. But what if that division were radicalized? The plan would be to feed extreme narratives on both sides: conspiracy theories, fear of the other, and the idea that the system is irredeemably corrupt. Next comes institutional crisis. Imagine a contested presidential election, like in 2020, but without restraint. Armed protests, congressional paralysis, governors refusing to comply with federal orders. The country enters a state of internal Cold War. Meanwhile, infrastructure crumbles. Blackouts, logistical collapses, medicine shortages. Confidence in the federal government disappears. States like California and Texas begin to act as semi-independent nations.
The idea of United States becomes symbolic, not functional. The healthcare system collapses, inequality explodes, urban violence spreads, and the military, divided between political loyalties, hesitates to intervene. In this scenario, the U.S. can no longer project power outward. Its military bases become isolated islands, its allies lose faith, and its rivals, China, Russia, and Iran, advance in silence. The empire isn't defeated, it implodes. And all of this in just 10 years.
Now that you've seen how the United States could lose its hegemony in just 10 years, the question is, who is already executing this plan? If you want to understand the backstage of global power and why the next empire might not even use tanks, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every video is a strategic plan you won't see on the news. And remember, whoever understands the game is never just a piece.